Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everybody who is here in person this evening. I want to welcome all of our online guests to this very important conversation with Dr. Michael Koplow and Rabbi Neil Zuckerman about what's happening in Israel today. I like to introduce these programs always with a little bit of Torah. So this week's Torah portion, Vayishlach, we see Jacob, who is preparing to reunite with his brother Esau. His brother threatened to kill him last time they were together because Jacob stole Esau's blessing. So it must have been with great trepidation and anxiety that Jacob anticipated this reunion. And we read that he prepares for this reunion very carefully and thoughtfully, and then he's alone at night. And we learn that he wrestles with a man. The rabbis have a lot of interpretations, whether it's a man, an angel, it's a dream, it's real. But we learn that in this wrestling, Jacob's name is changed from Jacob to Israel because, as this being says, Jacob wrestled with beings divine and human and prevailed. We are Israel in the night, in the dark. When Jacob wrestled with this being, Jacob was injured. We are suffering injury in this darkness, and yet we learn that Israel prevailed. I think it's incredibly prescient that that is the message of our Parsha this evening and this week. And I also want to fast forward to the end of this week's Torah portion, to the much anticipated reunion between the two brothers. This reunion where Esau was threatening to kill his brother shows up as Esau greeting Jacob, falling upon him with kisses and weeping. The reunion of two estranged brothers is a reconciliation. It's a reconciliation that is, at the very least, a warm gathering of the two brothers, and I like to think of it as a hopeful prospect for what we are going through now. That at the end of all this, that there can be some kind of peaceful resolution and reconciliation that the Torah lets us know is possible. So thank you, Dr. Michael Koplow, for joining us this evening. Just a bit about Michael's background and bio. Michael Koplow is the Chief Policy Officer of Israel Policy Forum and serves as a Senior Research Fellow of the Kogod Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow Column, which I highly recommend. I read it religiously, pun intended, and edits Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry, and his work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Forward, among other publications. He holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, a BA from Brandeis University, a JD from New York University, and an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. And with that, I turn it over to Rabbi Zuckerman.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufman. I want to welcome everyone here this evening. I want to welcome especially the TEED, the IPF Young Professionals Group, and next door, the Park Avenue Synagogue, sort of 20s and young professionals, 20s and 30s. What are we calling them, right? What? 20s and 30s. Okay, great. It's great to see you all here for what I think will be an important conversation tonight. I want to echo what Rabbi Kaufman said. If you aren't reading IPF in general, and Michael in particular, you're missing out on, I think, invaluable analysis about what's going on, not just in Israel, but the Middle East, and I think even, the North American Jewish community as well. So, Michael, we're grateful you're here. I want to thank you. The last time we were together was on Zoom during COVID, so to have you in person here is far better, and to have a live audience and those who are joining us online, I want to welcome you as well. So let's jump right in because, as I said to you when we were speaking beforehand, with what we want to talk about, if we're out of here by 10 o'clock, we'll be lucky. But there's a lot to jump into, and I know clearly there are things happening in this moment. But I want to back us up a little bit to October 7th. In the aftermath of that brutal attack, really the worst carnage for the Jewish people since the Shoah, You wrote a piece in IPF titled The Great Shattering. And I want to frame our conversation by understanding the significance of that day beyond the 1,200 people murdered, the 250 hostages that were taken. But what happened that day, right? What was that all about? What was shattered? Because there was more shattered than just lives. There was a whole, the whole understanding of the conflict was shattered. And I'd love for you to unpack what happened that day.
So thank you, Rabbi Zuckerman, and Rabbi Kaufman, and I see Rabbi Cosgrove back there as well. And thanks to Park Avenue Synagogue for hosting this event tonight. October 7th was indeed shattering on many levels. So, there's the obvious level, which is that Israel went through an unbelievable trauma. People have compared it to all sorts of things, and there are all sorts of ways to put it into context. One of the ways I think that, at least for me, is the most arresting is when we think about the way in which the Second Intifada really shaped Israeli society and Israeli politics and constituted this great trauma for Israelis. About the same number of Israelis were killed during the Second Intifada over the course of about 5 years as were killed on one day, on October 7th. And it's an enormous thing for Israelis to absorb, and we're seeing how that's happening. And so on the one hand, there is this idea of certainly personal trauma, and it, of course, isn't just the Israelis who were killed. It's also the hostages, 60 of whom, thankfully, are now back in Israeli hands, and hopefully there'll be another 10 tomorrow, and hopefully more to come. But Israel's entire conception of how it was dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with Hamas, with Palestinians writ large, was shattered as well, and in a number of different ways. So, for starters, I think there was this idea inside of Israel before October 7th, and in many ways it's personified, I think, best by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could simply be managed, that it could be managed in all sorts of different ways. There was one system of managing it in the West Bank, there was another system of managing it in Gaza, and that this could effectively go on perhaps indefinitely, and that Israel could stay on top of it. There was a really prescient article written by my friend Natan Sachs, who is at the Brookings Institution. He wrote it at this point, I want to say 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And he wrote it in Foreign Affairs, and it talked about Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach, which was basically what he termed anti-solutionism, that there's no good solution to things, and so you don't have to actually find one. You can just push things off and manage things until the situation changes, or perhaps until the end of time. And I think that October 7th demonstrated that that is not the case and won't be the case going forward. Second, particularly with regard to Hamas, the entire way in which Israel and the political establishment and the security establishment and the analytical community, of which I very much include myself, were wrong, and wrong in a major way. There was a real conviction pretty much across the board before October 7th that if you opened up the economy in Gaza, if you created bottom-up pressure on Hamas and groups like Hamas, that they wouldn't necessarily moderate their ideology, but that they would moderate their behavior, that they would be forced to govern, that they would be forced to take ownership of the people that they were in charge of. And that very tragically and drastically turned out to not be the case. And that isn't just an analytical failure that people like me have to deal with. It means that Israel's entire approach to Gaza and to the rest of the Palestinian arena really has to change in a way that nobody inside of Israel has grappled with for a very long time. Third, I think that the American Jewish conception of Israel in some ways shattered as well. We are used to thinking of Israel as a safe space for Jews, as a stronghold. When we think about the importance of Israel. We attribute many things to it, but one of the things that we attribute to Israel is this idea that if things ever get bad here or anywhere else in the world, we can pick up and we can go to Israel, because that is the purpose of having a Jewish state. That is one of the promises and successes of Zionism. That's one of the things that the state of Israel fulfills. And I don't think that we should sit here and say Israel is no longer the safe haven for Jews. It's, I think, always going to be a safe haven from some types of dangers, particularly anti-Semitism. But the notion of fortress Israel for Jewish safety, and the notion that Israel was this preeminent state in the region that basically had solved all of its external threats, all of its security threats, save for Iran, which is, of course, related to October 7th, but I think in a different way. That as well has been shattered, and it's been shattered certainly for American Jews. I think it's been shattered for Israelis as well. And Israel, I think, on October 6th was coming off what was basically a golden era. You had this idea of Israel as startup nation. You had this idea of Israel starting to, judicial overhaul notwithstanding, overcome some of the long-standing divisions within Israeli society. You had this idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was on the back burner and really wasn't a problem. We were only a few years removed from the Abraham Accords, the idea that Israel was being integrated into the region in a way that it never had before, and that in doing so, it could also, in many ways, bypass the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And sitting here now, 7 weeks beyond October 7th, I think that many of those things are either no longer the case or are not nearly as strong as we perhaps believed. And so I think this isn't just a normal security incident. It's not just a normal or even devastating terrorist attack. I think that many of the ways in which Israelis viewed themselves and viewed their place in the world has been changed irrevocably. And I think that many of the ways in which we as American Jews view Israel and what it is have changed as well. And I think will continue to change as some of this plays out.
You know, I've read analysis that speaks about this, the myth of invincibility, right? Not just about the military, but also the intelligence, and that at least part of this war is about reasserting that invincibility, right? And Israel needs to show the region that it's strong and that its intelligence continues to be strong. One of the questions that came in through pre-dialogue was this notion of how did the intelligence miss it, right? So it's, you mentioned your own limitations in terms of analysis, right? The analysis missed it, but what about the intelligence? I mean, I know that Israel's kind of punting that question, but what's your sense of what happened there?
So there's actually been a lot of reporting on that just over the past few days, and there were a number of exposés in the Israeli press actually this morning. So it's still not 100% clear exactly what was missed and how much was missed, but it seems that there were a few failures. So kind of at the highest level, there was a failure that was due to this preconception of what Hamas wanted and what Hamas was up to. And so you had this idea across the Israeli intelligence spectrum that Hamas did not constitute a huge threat, that its capabilities were more limited than people understood, that it did not want to actually ignite hostilities with Israel. There was really a 2 to 3 year period leading up to October 7th where Hamas was particularly active in the West Bank and quiet in Gaza. Of the previous 4 rounds of fighting between Israel and groups in Gaza, Hamas sat out 3 of the previous 4. It was just exchanges between Israel and Islamic Jihad. And so there was this idea that, particularly when it came to Gaza, Hamas did not want to get into any sort of fight with Israel. And so that, I think, led to a lot of things being ignored. In the past few weeks, and particularly the past few days, there's been reporting on some of the detailed incidents that happened, and it turns out that many of the IDF soldiers whose job was to stay on the southern border with Gaza and to watch what was going on, almost all of whom were female soldiers, did indeed pick up on what was happening. They were watching Hamas drill along the fence. They were reporting it to their superiors, and they were basically being ignored and told, well, Hamas isn't actually preparing for anything. They're just trying to increase pressure so that they can get more economic concessions from Israel. This isn't actually drilling for anything real. There was somebody in Israel's Unit 8200, Shmona Matayim, which is the most prestigious intelligence unit. Most of the people who work in Shmona Matayim go on to make lots of money in high-tech careers. It's a very popular unit to want to be part of. And it was reported today that there was one person within 8200, also a female soldier, who had written a report saying, this is what Hamas is up to. They're preparing for an attack on Israel. This is what's going to happen. And there's some reporting that it may have made its way up the chain to the head of military intelligence. There's other reporting that it didn't, that it got buried. But what this all points to is that people who were on the ground, whose job it was to watch the day-to-day but not necessarily put all the pieces together, were watching what was happening and were saying, listen, we think Hamas is preparing for something. And the people whose job it was to take all of that and put the pieces together and form a larger view completely missed it. And so, as is, I think, the case often, the people who were closest to the situation understood it very well. The people whose job it was to be their supervisors understood it less well, and the voices didn't get filtered up in the way that they should.
Yeah, and this will obviously be a story that continues to unfold, and post-war will, reach its, its proper conclusions. You said something earlier about the shift in policy, that containment essentially is no longer possible, right? We're not going to contain Hamas anymore. And Israel reaches a conclusion as a result of October 7th that the only way to deal with Hamas is to eradicate them. I want to come back to that later, but I want to apply the same reasoning to the north. Right, I mean, the conventional wisdom would tell you that Hezbollah is a far more formidable fighting force. What do they have, 160,000 rockets buried under villages? I would have thought by now, were it not for the destroyer groups off the coast, that Hezbollah would have engaged Israel more than they have. What's in your analysis, what's going on in the north? What's Hezbollah waiting for? There could be an argument to be made that Israel should take care of Hezbollah now while the momentum is there and they've got 350,000 reservists called up. What's your sense of what's happening with the north?
There are two sides to this. There's the Hezbollah calculus and there is the Israeli calculus. So let's start first with the Hezbollah calculus. There are two basic theories about Hezbollah and what it is or isn't up to. Theory number one is that Iran has built up Hezbollah as a force sitting on Israel's border effectively as a defensive weapon. And in this way, they're using Hezbollah as they would use a nuclear weapon. Within international relations theory, nuclear weapons are seen as defensive, not offensive. And the reason they're seen as defensive is because if you have a nuclear weapon, you are effectively immune from attack because your attacker will always be worried that you will use that nuclear weapon. Iran, as far as we know, does not yet have nuclear capability, but what they have done is built up Hezbollah to serve the same purpose, so that if Israel or the United States or anybody else wants to strike at Iran, Hezbollah is sitting there with its tens of thousands of fighters who now have a decade of training in fighting in the Syrian civil war. This is probably actually one of the, at this point, best trained and most experienced fighting forces anywhere outside of Russia and Ukraine. They have somewhere, nobody knows exactly, but 130,000, 160,000 rockets and missiles, many of which are guided missiles, not crude rockets like Hamas has, that are trained on Israel and that can cover the entire country. And so if you're contemplating a strike on Iran, Hezbollah, as this theory goes, is basically a defensive weapon preventing that strike from happening, because if Israel or the US strikes Iran, then Hezbollah gets involved and effectively shuts down Israel and causes what will be incalculable damage. That's theory number one. Theory number two is that Hezbollah is intended to be used the same way that Hamas was just used against Israel, and they may be waiting for the most opportune time. And that opportune time may be when they think that Israel is bogged down in Gaza, and or perhaps if another front opens in the West Bank, which is something we should definitely talk about. Or perhaps the opportune time is right before Hamas is about to be destroyed, and that's when Hezbollah enters the fray to make sure that then Israel has to rush to the north and save Hamas. There's no way of knowing which of these two theories is correct. At the risk of putting myself out there and being wrong on something else, I will say that I'm firmly in camp one. I think that Hezbollah has gotten the most Iranian attention and funding precisely because they want to avert a strike on Iran. But that obviously could be very wrong, and it may well be that in a few weeks from now, we will see Hezbollah enter at what they think is a good moment for them. At the moment, they seem to be, if you think that they want to enter, they seem to be deterred by the US presence in the region with the two carrier strike groups and very obvious bellicosity from President Biden and other American leaders warning them not to get involved. So that's the Hezbollah calculus. Then we have the Israeli calculus. And here we go back to these questions of deterrence and containment. Before October 7th, Israel relied very heavily on deterrence against both Hezbollah and against Hamas. And you'll hear Israelis talk about what they refer to as the Dahiya Doctrine, and that is something that arose out of the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, where Israel effectively destroyed the Dahiya corridor in Beirut, which is Hezbollah's headquarters. And they did not just go after Hezbollah itself, they went after the entirety of this neighborhood in Beirut. And the idea was that they destroyed it so thoroughly and they demonstrated such force that Hezbollah was deterred. They wouldn't want to risk that happening again. And in a post-October 7th world, where Hamas was right up on the border fence and then streamed across, Israelis are really no longer willing to live in a world where they have to rely on deterrence. And part of what is happening in Gaza, as you alluded to earlier, is an effort to reestablish that deterrence by demonstrating that Israel can take care of Hamas in Gaza and can go in and can suffer what is so far relatively minimal casualties and do the job it has to do. And that's supposed to have a deterrent effect on other groups in the region. But I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, and what I heard consistently from folks in the security establishment, from folks in the Ministry of Defense, the IDF, defense journalists, almost everybody I spoke to, was a consistent message that nobody can afford to rely on deterrence, that the Israelis who have been evacuated from communities in the north will not go back so long as Hezbollah is sitting on the border. The fighting in 2006 ended with UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was supposed to have Hezbollah stay north of the Litani River. Hezbollah has since 2006 very steadily moved south of the Litani River, which is why they're sitting right across from Israel. And what I heard across the board from Israelis is that that situation cannot stand, and that Hezbollah is going to have to be pushed back north so that there can be no surprise invasion or infiltration of Israel. Now, lots of people inside of Israel and outside of Israel have the hope that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 can be better enforced, that a bunch of outside actors can step in and convince Hezbollah to go back north of the Litani River, and that can be verified either by UNIFIL, which is the force that's there now that's supposed to be keeping the peace, or by some other body. But I got to tell you, many more Israelis seem to be resigned to the idea that Israel is going to have to do this militarily, irrespective of whatever happens in Gaza. And so if we'd had this conversation 3 weeks ago, I would have sat here and I think I would have said to you that the chances of war in the north are not nothing, but lower than many people perhaps expect, because Hezbollah does seem to be deterred. After having spent time in Israel talking to all sorts of folks, at this point, I think my assessment is that war in the north is a much higher probability, not because of Hezbollah, but because Israel is not prepared to live with them sitting where they are, and because the Israelis who evacuated those northern communities simply will not go back unless the situation changes.
Right. I think I read something you wrote where it's not as if Israel is going to cede territory, to put buffer zones within Israel, right? Which is essentially, if there's going to be a buffer zone, it's not, same thing in the south, right? It's not going to be in Israeli territory, it would be inside the Gaza Strip. That's a sobering assessment, right? Because it's not, right, Israel's not going to enter Lebanon gently, right? And as close as Hezbollah is. So it does feel like you're suggesting that there would be another front open as Israel tries to create that buffer zone, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong possibility that happens. Hopefully it will be on Israel's terms and not on Hezbollah's terms or anyone else's terms. But there is definitely that possibility. And one of the things that Israelis keep on saying since October 7th is that their borders have effectively been shrunk because they feel like they cannot live on the border with Gaza, and they feel like they cannot live on the border with Lebanon. And the West Bank may present its own problem eventually that will effectively shrink Israel's borders there as well. And Israel is not prepared to live with that sort of situation indefinitely.
All right, so you opened up the door on the West Bank. Let's talk about that a little bit. What's happening there? We're very focused on Gaza, obviously, and a lot of attention in the north. What's happening with the West Bank?
What's happening in the West Bank is perhaps the most underreported story that is taking place right now, and it's not only the most underreported, in some ways it should be the most worrisome. What you have happening in the West Bank is a ramping up of trends that were taking place before October 7th. What we saw before October 7th was that 2023 was already the deadliest year in the West Bank for Palestinians and for Israelis since the end of the Second Intifada. People here are probably very aware of the terrorism and the terrorist attacks that had taken place against Israelis inside of Israel, but even more so inside of the West Bank. There were some particularly shocking terrorist murders of Israelis in Hawara, in the Jordan Valley. A lot of this was Palestinians shooting at Israeli traffic on roads in the West Bank. But in addition to that, before October 7th, you had, if memory serves me correctly, you had over 200 Palestinians who had been killed inside of the West Bank in 2023 up until before October 7th. And that was a combination of things. It was during IDF raids into Palestinian cities intended to root out Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but it was also the result of Israeli attacks on Palestinians living in the West Bank, many of whom live in Area C, which is the 60% of the West Bank that is controlled entirely by Israel. And within Area C, you have every Israeli who lives inside of a West Bank settlement, and that's about 470,000 Israelis living in Area C, and you also have about 300,000 Palestinians living in Area C. And you have these two populations living in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank. And while they're not interlocking by any means, in many cases they're in very close proximity to each other. And under this government, there was increased friction between these two populations, largely stemming from increased settler violence against Palestinians. That was all taking place before October 7th. Since October 7th, as of today, I believe the number is 238 Palestinians who have been killed inside the West Bank. That's only since October 7th alone, and approximately 155 of them are civilians. So a large number of gunmen, but many civilians.
And what are the conditions that they've been, is this rioting settlers who are doing this?
So some of it is indeed rioting settlers. In many cases, these are settlers who are, since October 7th, accompanied by IDF reservists, because at this point, all of the active duty non-reservists who were in the West Bank are either doing raids into Palestinian cities to arrest Hamas and Islamic Jihad gunmen, or they've been sent north or south. So almost every single soldier who is now in the West Bank in charge of security for Israelis and for Israeli settlements are reservists. They are less trained, less disciplined, less everything. Right. And so part of it is that. Part of it is that you have the IDF making these nightly and daytime raids into Palestinian cities, and at this point, they have arrested, by IDF estimates, something around the order of 900 Hamas and Islamic Jihad gunmen. But when they make these raids, they get confronted by lots of people, and that results in deaths as well, some of whom are gunmen, but some of whom are not. And so you have this massively increased Palestinian death toll inside the West Bank. In addition, we have this ugly phenomenon of the most extremist settlers taking advantage of the fact that the IDF is distracted elsewhere to push Palestinians out of their villages and off of their agricultural land inside the West Bank. And there have been, at this point, something between 150 and 200 separate attacks on Palestinians since October 7th. The UN estimates that 50% of Palestinian farmland in the West Bank has gone unharvested in 2023 because anytime they try to go and harvest olives, they're violently prevented from doing so. You have about 900 Palestinians who have gotten up and abandoned their villages, also in Area C. This is territory controlled entirely by Israel, because they are having settlers show up in their villages and telling them they have 24 hours to leave or they'll be killed, throwing fake blood on their door, all the sorts of things that that we read about and are horrified at have been taking place with increasing frequency since October 7th. And what this is leading to is not only, to my mind, a crisis for the IDF because they have to deal with this. It is leading, as people here I'm sure have noticed, to a lot of tension between the United States and Israel. It shouldn't escape anybody's notice that since October 7th, there have been increased warnings from President Biden directly, from Secretary Blinken directly, from members of Congress about settler violence. And when we look at these polls, and we also see that not within Gaza, but within the West Bank, support for Hamas is going up since October 7th, a lot of that is tied to the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank do not think that the Palestinian Authority can protect them because they are effectively being left, left to the whims of some of the most extreme folks inside of the West Bank. And so, much like the situation in Gaza could not continue indefinitely and could not be managed, this is not going to continue indefinitely as it is. This cannot be managed either, and I really worry, almost more than anything else, that this is the front that's going to erupt. And if it does, unlike Gaza, where you had 2.2 million Palestinians and no Israelis, inside of the West Bank, you have 3 million Palestinians and 470,000 Israelis. That makes security far more difficult. It's a much longer border to secure. It's obviously much less surrounded, much less guarded, much closer to Israel proper. And if things explode inside the West Bank, it's going to make Gaza look like a cakewalk.
So my sense is that people are hearing, while they may know about some of this vaguely, the numbers you're giving are probably numbers that people aren't aware of, because I don't see this reported in the press. I mean, if you're reading Times of Israel, I don't see a lot of articles about this. Why? And even the American press, which has no problem sort of critiquing settlers, why are we not hearing more about this?
So I think we're hearing about it on the margins, but part of what's going on is that because Israeli society is understandably so consumed with the events of October 7th, so consumed with the fate of the hostages and getting them back, so consumed with degrading Hamas militarily and removing it from governing power in Gaza, it's very difficult for, I think, many Israelis to focus on anything else. For them, they're still in the middle of trauma. They're not in a post-trauma state. They're still in the middle of this trauma and this shock. And they simply are not focusing on anything else. And some of the most irresponsible actors within Israeli politics and within Israeli society are taking advantage of that to effectively run wild inside of the West Bank, understanding that very few people are paying attention, that even if people are paying attention, there's very little bandwidth to deal with it, that the Israeli government and the IDF have lots of other priorities at the moment, and it's effectively whack-a-mole.
And the government's probably not going to restrain them, the current government.
I think it's safe to say that the current government is not going to restrain them. Indeed, the Israeli cabinet yesterday approved a supplemental budget for the rest of the year. It still has to go and be approved by the rest of the Knesset. And one of the reasons that they had to approve a new budget was because you had 7 billion shekels that were allocated to coalition discretionary funds, effectively a slush fund for parties in the coalition to use on their political priorities. And one of the things people said after October 7th was, this is crazy, this should be repurposed towards the war effort. And much of it was, but 30% of it was still retained for coalition discretionary funds. And of that 30%, approximately $105 million of it, which is, works out to about 430 shekels, I think, 430 million shekels with the current exchange rate, was allocated to amorphous West Bank purposes. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and also the minister in the defense ministry, who is in charge of civilian affairs in the West Bank, says that it is intended for security. And what that means is forming civilian security squads made up of Israelis who live inside the West Bank and giving them weapons. And as much as it is important, certainly, to defend Israeli citizens no matter where they are living, whether they're living inside of Israel proper or inside of the West Bank, arming some of the most extreme settlers inside the West Bank is inevitably going to lead to unprovoked violence against Palestinians. And I worry that this is not only not getting better, that it's about to get worse as a result of this government's priorities.
And we could be looking at a third front of this war.
Yes.
Right. I want to shift gears and talk about what's happening now. So we've all read, or people who are reading what's happening know that early on there was a hostage proposal, if I'm not mistaken, by Hamas. Israel rejected it. What changed, or how has the equation changed that now we see a ceasefire, hostage release, prisoner release, et cetera? Right? What led to Israel saying, I mean, I know there was a big rally, there's pressure, a lot of pressure from hostage families and from civilians, but Israel has stated very clearly their mission is to eradicate Hamas. Now we see a ceasefire that will be extended, and who knows what will happen. What changed, and how's the equation different now?
A lot of it is due to an incredibly effective grassroots movement inside of Israel from the families of the hostages and from the families of people who are missing. It's easy to, even from afar, see what's taking place and see how these families are demonstrating and securing lots of grassroots and public support. But when you are there, it's all around you in an all-encompassing way. In Tel Aviv, normally a place where you see all sorts of advertisements and billboards, I did not see one commercial advertisement. Every single billboard that had been up was gone, and they were now billboards either with messages like "Biachad Natzeach," together we will win, or usually pictures of hostages. Digital advertising was just on an endless loop of pictures of hostages. On Israeli TV and Israeli media, it's almost an endless stream of stories both of heroism and of harrowing, awful events from October 7th. And all of that really lends to this idea that the most important thing is to secure the release of the hostages. And so I think this grassroots movement put enormous pressure on the government to do something about it, because certainly in the beginning, I think that the issue of the hostages definitely seemed to be downplayed in contrast to the other stated goal, which was destroying Hamas, and now things seem to have flipped in a real way. The other aspect here was that the United States has been working as well to secure the release of hostages, partially because there are Americans who had been and still are being held hostage. And for the Biden administration, getting them back was also a real priority. And so I think those two things together combined to create this pressure on the Israeli government. And it's, when you look at some of the polling that was done inside of Israel, the week after October 7th, a huge, overwhelming majority of Israelis wanted to see an immediate ground operation, and without regard to what the fate of the hostages would be. And a couple of weeks later, you were already down to fewer than half of Israelis who wanted to see a ground operation. More people wanted to see something done to secure the release of the hostages. And there have not been very many bright spots, obviously, since October 7th. I'm not sure I've said one thing tonight that can be construed as optimistic in any way at all. But I will say that this has been an optimistic week. I think that whatever you want to see happen next in terms of Israel's military campaign, watching these now 60 and hopefully soon 70 hostages return is incredible. To see them returned, most of them in okay condition, certainly worse for the wear. Right. But I think there really is optimism that they will be okay. Seeing kids reunited with parents or with extended family, I'm not sure how anybody can watch that and think that this isn't a good thing. And we can talk about some of the pitfalls that may be ahead, and we can talk about some of the potential downsides, but anybody who's watching this, I hope, understands what a big deal this is. And I should also add that even if we look at it just in terms of what it took to get them back, in 2011, Israel traded over 1,000 terrorists for one person, for Gilad Shalit. And almost half of those terrorists that they traded, terrorists and prisoners for Gilad Shalit, had blood on their hands. And this time around, the ratio was not 1,000 to 1. The ratio was 3 to 1. And none of the people who were released were in prison for successful murder of Israelis, some for attempted murder and some for injuring Israelis. But even in the context of what it takes to get Israelis back, this is far better than what Israel has gotten in the past. And so I think there are, as I said, many reasons to be looking at what's happened over the course of the past week, and I think to be heartened and have something to smile about.
Yeah. Let's talk about the pitfalls just for a minute. And you're right. I mean, you cannot watch the images without feeling grateful that people are reunited with their families. This morning I read a piece by Michael Oren where he was essentially framing this as Sophie's choice, right? And I'll just read you a quote from him. This is our fundamental nightmarish dilemma. Either we give priority to restoring our deterrence power and returning the more than 200,000 displaced Israelis to their homes, or we focus primarily on securing the hostages' freedom. And he goes on to sort of extend that very binary proposition, right? We either fight the war and eradicate Hamas, or we essentially give in to a ceasefire and bring home hostages. Do you see it, do you see it in quite those stark of terms? And what are some of the pitfalls that you were speaking about?
I don't see it in quite such stark terms. So it's important to remember that the initial Hamas position after October 7th was, you Israelis can have all the hostages back in return for 6,000 prisoners sitting in Israeli jails. And obviously the price came down significantly. And that was as a result of Israel's military campaign. Now, it's a little hard to assess how successful the military campaign has been. We just don't have enough information. We don't know how many Hamas fighters have been killed. We don't know how many of them have relocated to the south. I've seen Israeli military journalists who estimate that out of what was presumed to be about 32,000 Hamas fighters, that 2,000 have been killed. I've seen some estimates that 5,000 have been killed. Whatever it is, there's clearly still a huge Hamas presence in the south. And there are also reports that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, has been tooling around the tunnels and visiting hostages. In this last round of hostages yesterday, they were transported back to Israel from northern Gaza, so there's clearly still a Hamas presence there. So hard to say just how successful the campaign has been, but there does seem little question that it has put some sort of pressure on Hamas that led to a better deal. So I'm not sure that we can talk about these things as being zero-sum when it does seem as if, to some extent, the military campaign does indeed impact the variables around a hostage release. With that said, there definitely are pitfalls, and one of them is that with this sort of thing, there's always the problem of moral hazard. Hamas kidnapped Gilad Shalit, they got 1,000 prisoners back, and if you think that that didn't directly lead to their planning for October 7th, you're probably not thinking through things fully, right? And here too, Hamas had 240 hostages, and they still have, let's assume that it's 170, somewhere around there. And they've learned the lesson that they can, once again, trade those hostages for their own prisoners, that if they have hostages, that may lead to an Israeli ceasefire, and that is going to create conditions down the road that create more incentives to kidnap Israelis and hold them hostage. Third, I worry that Israel is repeating a mistake with this that they made in the past, which is to effectively let Hamas reap the benefits of something and not allowing the Palestinian Authority, which for all its faults is the far more responsible Palestinian actor, not letting that actor reap the benefits. Because if you are a Palestinian right now and you're sitting here and you're looking at this, what are you likely saying to yourself? What you're likely saying to yourself is the Palestinian Authority has had no ability to get Israel to release any Palestinian prisoners. And Palestinian prisoners in Palestinian society are held in enormously high esteem. Part of that is because by some estimates, since 1967, over 1 million Palestinians have spent time in Israeli jails. And so every family is touched by this issue. Some of those prisoners absolutely deserve to be in Israeli prisons. Some of them maybe not quite as much. But Palestinian prisoners are kind of the highest rung of Palestinian society and accorded with enormous honor and respect. Palestinian Authority can't get them out. Hamas just got 150 out, with more to come. So if you're a Palestinian, the lesson here very well may be that it's Hamas's approach that is the one that works. And again, if you look at rising support for Hamas in the West Bank, where they have not been affected by the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, you can start to understand why that might be the case in light of what's happening. If Israel was going to release prisoners, I wish that they had done so in some way, shape, or form that would at least give some credit to the Palestinian Authority, because at the moment, it's Hamas that undoubtedly is going to be parading this around and saying, hey, look, our method works, and this is the proof.
Right, and based on your analysis here, the idea then that the Palestinian Authority would step in and rule, fill the void of Hamas makes it all the more problematic if people don't feel the confidence that they can actually, serve their interests.
Right.
I want to, we're pressing on time here, and there might be a couple questions we'll take from the audience, but I do want to shift to sort of the day after. And you wrote, and I agree with this, having been in Israel for a few weeks ago and seeing the ways in which American Jews are responding to what feels like a unified Israel, especially after the last 10 months of the protests. It feels, right, well, we see pictures of Haredim, joining the army and tying tzitzit, and, right, and there just seems to be a civic spirit of coming together and fighting this war. You write about this phrase, biyachad ninatzeach, that together we will be victorious, and it's not really the case, and that if you scratch under the surface a little bit, you'll see a very divided Israel that actually, in your analysis, feels like once this war is over, it's then we'll see how divided Israel really is. So I'm wondering if we could shift into a little bit of the day after. What does it look? Right? Unpack a little bit this myth of a unified Israel, and B, what does that mean when this war is over, both for Israeli society, for Netanyahu, and any other details you want to throw in that mix, and then maybe we'll take a couple questions.
So we have seen Israeli society come together in a remarkable way. There have been Haredim who have enlisted. You do have secular Israelis all of a sudden learning how to tie tzitzit for soldiers who want them. All of the civil society organizations that had sprung up to protest the government against the judicial overhaul transformed overnight into aid organizations and civil defense organizations. Achim Laneshek, Brothers in Arms, I met with them when I was in Israel, and they have, what did they tell me, 4 different logistics warehouses set up around Israel where they're providing supplies to everybody. No more protesting. No more political activities, and this is kind of the case across the board. And it's also the case that when you speak to a lot of these groups, and when you speak to bereaved families, and when you speak to people in the Hostage and Missing Families Forum, there is burning anger at the government. Burning anger. Nobody wants to do anything about it now because everybody says we're in the middle of a war and now is not the time. But the second the fighting is over, the divisions that we saw inside of Israel over the course of this year before October 7th are going to come rushing back in an instant. And this time, they're going to be even more charged because they aren't over just the question of Israeli democracy and judicial overhaul and all the things that were being debated in the streets of Israel before October 7th. This time, they are over this unshakable idea that the government that was in power is responsible for much of what happened, and that government is determined not to go anywhere. And what we're going to see, I fear, is very quick resignations from Herzi Halevi, the IDF chief of staff, from Aharon Khaliva, the head of IDF military intelligence, from Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, probably from a whole bunch of other folks. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government are not going to resign. And if you have any doubt about that, there was a report, it was either today or yesterday, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been going around to different members of his Likud faction in the Knesset, meeting with them and saying to them, you cannot risk getting rid of me because only I will continue to prevent a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza when this is over. He is doing everything he can to lay the groundwork for sticking around. Now, anybody who is not Prime Minister Netanyahu or a member of his immediate family knows that he's not going to survive this. His political career is over, and I think his reputation is forever going to be in tatters, but he doesn't acknowledge that yet, and he's going to do his best to hang on as long as he can. And what I heard from all sorts of people is that the second the reservists are back from Gaza or from the north or from wherever they are going to be outside of the Knesset in the hundreds of thousands, protesting 24 hours a day until the government leaves. And the government is gearing up not to leave, and that is going to produce a clash that is going to be much worse than what we saw before. Now, ultimately, I think that the trauma of October 7th and the volunteer ethos that has really seized all of Israel is going to come through. And when there is a different government, it's going to have incredibly broad and deep support. Just to give you a sense of what that's going to look like, at the moment, Benny Gantz, just by himself, his party alone, is polling at around 41 or 42 seats. The 5 parties that make up Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition are polling together, the 5 of them, at 40, 41 seats. So Benny Gantz himself might have more seats than this entire government combined. And there is going to be a real consensus inside of Israel about what the government should look like and probably about what should be done. But that point is not going to come the day that the fighting ends. And I think everybody needs to be worried about what that transition period is going to look like, because it's going to be ugly and it's going to be fraught, and it may involve violence in the streets.
That is both a optimistic and sobering message. Optimistic for you. I know you're an optimistic human being, but there is some light there. Couldn't the government just fall? I mean, right? I mean, whether Bibi wants to stay in power or not, and I don't know anybody, even Bibi, many Bibi supporters I know who wouldn't vote for him. But why is it his choice? Couldn't the coalition just break apart, based on the polling that you're quoting and that we've all read?
So there have been a number of changes in Israel over the past decade that make it very difficult to replace a government. The most important one is that before 2014, if you had 61 members of Knesset vote no confidence in the government, then the government automatically dissolved. That was done away with in 2014. And the only option now is what's called a constructive vote of no confidence. What that means is you have to have 61 votes that are no confidence in the government, and then you simultaneously have to have at least 61 votes to form a new government comprised of the existing Knesset. So that means that the 64 seats that are part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition, you would have to get some of them to vote to form a new government from the parties that exist in the Knesset right now, and that seems very unlikely. The other way to do it is to have the Knesset pass a law calling for early elections, and that, again, needs 61 votes. And if you are a member of Knesset in these 5 parties and you see that a new election tomorrow will yield you 40 seats versus 64, there's probably not a high chance that you're going to vote for new elections. The other way in which it can happen is that under Israeli law, and people may remember this from the never-ending election cycle between 2019 and 2023, you have to pass a budget. If you don't pass a budget, then the government automatically dissolves and goes to new elections. This government passed a 2-year budget, and so I should probably look this up immediately. I don't know off the top of my head when the next budget has to be passed by, but I'm pretty sure it's within 12 months. And so if this government can't get its act together and pass a budget, then that could lead to the government falling before it should. But simply having 61 people who say, we don't have confidence in the prime minister, isn't enough.
We have 2 minutes. Do you think the ceasefire holds?
I think that it will. I think it will probably be extended for another 2 days or 4 days. I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Israeli government to keep it going. And I think that the Israeli government is going to want to demonstrate that because Hamas is still very much enforced in southern Gaza, that it can relaunch the military operation when it wants to. But I do think that whenever that happens, the military operation in the south is going to look very different from what we saw in the north. It's going to be, I don't think that the US is going to consent to the same type of massive bombing campaign in the south, because it's a small territory. You now have about 1.7 or 1.8 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza who are now clustered in the south. And that makes the same type of bombing campaign much harder, because you can't tell them to go elsewhere. And I also think that Israel is probably going to, at some point, transition to creating a buffer zone inside of Gaza and effectively making constant raids into territory inside of Gaza, but not staying in there and kind of occupying the territory the way they are right now in the north. So I do think we are going to see a continuing military campaign. I do think it will look different. When it restarts, I don't have a great guess, but I will be surprised if the ceasefire gets extended permanently.
And that would include probably holding reservists for a while, I assume, right?
Yes, I think that probably will involve holding reservists for a while. Some reservists have already started to be released, but until the government determines that whatever it wants to do in the South is finished, then I think the reservists are still going to be there.
And
for,
the North
for a
as
bit of
well.
time. And the North as well, absolutely.
Right. So I want to conclude by asking you to put on your most optimistic, your most optimistic analysis of where are we in a year from now?
So my most optimistic analysis is that a year from now, Hamas is no longer running Gaza, that there is some sort of interim transitional government there that is not Israel, that is not the IDF reoccupying Gaza militarily, that government is made up mostly of Palestinians who are from Gaza and have lived in Gaza, and that it is able to provide services to Palestinians there with an eye toward restoring Palestinian Authority governance in Gaza down the road, that Israelis who have evacuated the South can return to their communities, and I think that hopefully that can happen in relatively short order, that Israelis in the North have also returned to their communities, and hopefully that happens without an IDF military operation in the North against Hezbollah and everything that will entail, and that a year from now there is a new government in Israel that has the support of 70–80% of the Israeli people, that is working to not only rebuild the country from the war, but really to heal the divisions that were so prevalent within Israeli society beforehand, that the U.S.-Israel relationship remains strong, that American Jews continue to support Israel, continue to be overwhelmingly Zionist, continue to understand that Israel has to be an important component not only of our Jewish identity, but of our actual lived lives, and that the hostages, if the most optimistic take would be that all of them are back. Mm-hmm. Sadly, I don't think that's in the cards, but that as many of them are back as possible, and that they are beginning to heal and recover from the trauma they've undergone. That is my optimistic take, and I don't think that it's terribly far-fetched. It's not necessarily the most probable one, but it's not that far-fetched.
I agree, and I think that Israel will play a large role in that in terms of post-war setting the stage for, God willing, a government in Gaza that will rule and Israel won't necessarily have to worry about Hamas coming over the border, murdering, kidnapping, etc. I want to thank you, Michael, for being with us tonight, for your analysis. There's a lot that we didn't get to. I will again commend your column. You touched on this with American Jews. You wrote an excellent piece probably a few weeks ago about American Jews and the progressive Jews and relationships and what's happened there as a result. We didn't get to talk about that, but I would, many things I would commend you to go to the IPF website, take a look at that column and others. A lot more to talk about. I hope that you will come back another time and join us, but we're grateful for you, for your presence here tonight. I want to remind the Atid and Next Door groups that downstairs in the ballroom, there will be a further opportunity to debrief with Michael. Remember, I don't want to see others trying to sneak down there, right? But this is for Atid and for Next Door. Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And